as we were walking over here and getting this set up, we're in front of another different bay in the exhibition, and two of the pieces that I particularly like, and I think they work really, really well together in terms of palette and just the motifs. But one of the things that you wanted to kind of follow up on is, I alluded to, and the first solo show we had for Heather was like, gosh, I think 3 years ago now. And you'd done something very interesting there where you had, it was I think paper and fabric, but you were sewing using lots of beads and elements, and they were also very much layered and very interesting sort of patterns. And so there I think we even had specific textiles incorporated or fabrics incorporated, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe you had airbrushed patterns on paper and all that.
Yes.
But one of the things you reminded me of is that you never use glue.
Yes.
And you always use sewing and stitching.
Right.
And so what are the origins of that, and what's the significance to you about it? I personally like it. I think it's very interesting. It makes it much more handmade.
Right.
But
yeah, I've used technology for quite a few years since I moved to Detroit, and particularly the laser, and as a cutting tool. So most of my sculpture was, the templates were all cut by large industrial lasers in Detroit. And one of the aspects of that is the removal of the hand, the removal of the evidence of the hand, and then you use very slick surfaces like lacquer, urethane, and then you've even removed the hand exponentially. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to bring back that sense of the hand, so all the paperworks were joined using my hand to bead them. So we included a stitching system into the laser cutting of the paper parts. So all the paper parts were laser cut, then airbrushed using, again, lace as a stencil and a ready-made stencil, and then everything was joined with the hand. It added a stitch, which also added another aspect of patterning, and also brought back that visual notation of the hand moving up and down through the object.
right.
So that was really important to me to integrate those two. When you work using any kind of sprayed material, you do have a sense of invisibility. And then you sand to the point where you're erasing every kind of act that you've done in the work. By sanding, you're removing to reveal. And so this invisibility was really an interesting idea to me, to work with so much labor that then becomes erased by its process. And that's a big part of where these come from. So there's a lot of buildup, and then there's a lot of erasure, and then the invisibility of the person and of the labor. And I'm really drawn to work like that. That's Billy Al Bankston was extremely, as a younger artist, really influential to me. He never talked about that, but that's how I saw it.
Well, because I remember you commented about the dentos, and so those were the
It is the
aluminum.
Dento series I'm referring to.
Yes.
Yes.
And those were basically, he hand pressed those to create the sergeant's stripe medallion.
And then they were lacquered.
Right.
Yeah. But they also, I think that whole generation that came out of Los Angeles was working with the idea of being invisible, the invisible labor, the mass-produced object, and all of the new products that were coming onto the market, plastics and urethanes and resins.
Right.
All of that, Pashigan, all of those people were referencing and utilizing these things. And so for a young artist, a few generations off of that, seeing it, it was a different look and feel and a kind of visual. I'm very drawn to it, but I don't want to exclusively represent myself that way. So that's a big part of the sewing in all of my work. I hope that makes sense.
So is there an element at all of feminism in any of your work?
Oh,
then?
absolutely. If you look at the whole history of customizing, there are very few, if any, women. There are women, But you're going to be hard pressed to find women
Right.
that are represented by that. Women are represented by the use of fabrics or the lingerie lace on the hood of the car. It genders the car. It is the male perspective of what sexualizes the car. And so you have all these adjectives to describe car paints. And so you're, as a young artist or a woman growing up, you're represented through, of course, the gaze. And so I've tried for many years to turn that in another direction.
So basically, cars should be cars, and then in parens, she, her.
Yeah, because they're talked about that way. And
Yeah,
so it's absurd to think that I use every kind of fabric I can find.
Yeah.
But those guys, they reached for one kind of fabric and one kind of representation, which was their sexuality. It was like they couldn't grab this fabric and put it on their car. They'd have to find something that looked like lingerie of a woman.
Yeah, Victoria's Secret.
Yeah, pre-Victoria's Secret. So I always thought that and auto shows, because I go to tons of them, I love them. But I always thought, where am I in this configuration? I'm not sure this fits because I'm a maker.
Right.
And I want to invent my own language. And a lot of my work is about language that's invented for you and the restriction of inventing yourself or inventing something other than what's prescribed.
Right.
So I hope that I've always taught as a feminist, because I did teach for many years, and those are definitely my politics.
Well, very good. Because I wanted to make sure we kind of touched on that, because the sewing, I remember in that last show, was so pronounced in the beadwork.
Yeah.
And so that it sort of had a femininity about it, but at the same time, it had your usual sort of density of pattern and color, and these sort of binaries, between, is it painting, is it craft, is it high, is it low,
It's
is
all
it
those
male,
things.
is it female, and
Yeah.
so is it sculpture, is it painting, and so your work always seems to be rife with these sort of binaries and contrast, which creates a lot of internal tensions, and at the same time I think is what kind of keeps everything sort of fresh and alive. So we're standing in front of this one, which you had told me in your studio, I think when we were there in January, that there are a number of different designers that you really are inspired by a lot of times, and their innovation and just the uniqueness of what they do. And this is one of them. It's Issey Miyake. And why don't you describe this? You said it's called an epoch, and it's a very interesting and novel sort of process for creating this. So, and talk about then sort of what you sort of extracted from that for this particular piece.
The APOC, a piece of cloth, that's APOC. There was a large show in New York, I think it was in the 90s, at Ace Gallery when it existed. And I went and I saw Issey Miyake's new line of clothing, which were woven tubes. And so he revolutionized the planar fabric, the history of just planar fabric. These things were continuous, and then he sold them by cutting the tube. And so it revolutionized the way the fabric fit on the models' bodies, and it was an amazing show. And they have a pretty large collection. I'm trying to remember what museum in Paris. And I've always just been struck by how original they were. So this is one of his pieces of cloth from that series. This shape itself is from a tube that is cut, and a model's head would come through the top. And there was a lot of flexibility in how you could use these, but they basically slipped over and they were cut in a way that they would stay on the human body. They define the human body in a very different way. And I thought that was so exciting and so unusual and original.
So is this actually a replica, though, of the pattern?
Not at all.
Oh, okay. So
This
it's just,
whole pattern is, and even this part is my invention of, all I lifted from
was the basic form.
was the basic form, and it's
Gotcha.
also the painting on the other side is one of his. So many times I will use designers' forms, and then of course aberrate to my own desire. But a lot of that came from living in Detroit and learning about the history of Cranbrook Academy of Art and all of the Ray and Charles Eames, Nelson, all of those people touched industry in a way that completely revolutionized their work. So that was one of the opportunities of living in an amazing city like Detroit, where they manufacture and are interested in innovation. And so that's always been, since I've moved there and lived there, I really tried to learn the technology, not just apply it in the
Right.
sense of be able to physically do it, but also utilize all of the industry in the Detroit area. And I did a lot of that.
Was that a charter or a mandate of Cranbrook?
No.
Was
That's-
there some sort of, I mean, or is it just quirky that these people came? Because it almost in some ways seems like it was almost like a Bauhaus.
Yeah,
And,
I don't think so.
but there was no edict or mandate. People
No.
just scanned around and saw this new innovation going on in the auto industry and thought, wow, that could be interesting for, you know, furniture or textiles.
And it was.
And what have you. Okay.
The Marshmallow couch by George Nelson is all the fixtures of what attach those circular shapes to construct the couch, all come from, I don't know which of the companies, but it's an automotive invention. So it's a lot like we were talking about earlier about the technologies in Los Angeles were coming out of aerospace. All of
And
the
that was
artists.
influencing light and space movement.
Oh, the light and space, the fetish finish. So I don't think it's an edict. If someone starts using it, then everybody thinks, I want to tap into
Exactly,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And people morphed it in many different ways, you know.
Yeah, that's what's so creative about it.
Yeah,
right?
because they some people would pour it, some people would cast it, some people would, you know, just paint on it, or
Yeah.
you know, or start cutting it up and constructing with it, which the Eames did, and you know, with their chairs and things like that.
Right.
That clear lucite chair
Right.
was sort of like unbelievable and hard to believe how strong they are.
Yeah, it's
So-
because it was fiberglass,
Yeah.
and that was a relatively new technology. Yeah.
So these two I like a lot together, because this other one, the frame around it is very sort of a classical, like a floral pattern. You know, sort of, I mean, like leaves or some sort of vines coming around it. But the inside is very interesting because you do something very different here. And it's these spheres. There's a lot of like bubbles or spheres in this one, and they're distinct, very distinct. And you do now a black, white, gray sort of thing going on here, which really changes the game a little bit on this in terms of it's pattern on pattern, but it really stands out. And then you have other spheres that are like the ground. And then you have these yet other spheres which are very specifically patterned. And then you have others over here which are sort of ground and sort of, I mean, this is a big question mark. But the sort of bubbles and spheres is sort of unique in this body of work. There's not much else like it. Well, the eyeballs is sort of a little bit like the eyes that you had said in that other painting. What was because this is so different, what was sort of the inspiration here?
I think that, well, this painting and one of the others in the show uses basically the same stencil section or stencil information. So this kind of question mark is a fragment from a larger piece of sculpture from another culture. I just lifted it digitally and turned it into the kind of basis. This is possibly, for sure, this is the most worked surface of all of them. And that working, the most buildup and the most removal. And it was just constantly, the bubbles or the circles were always there to kind of break up the surface, but I cast instead of casting them simultaneously, I cast each one individually to create and watched it as I belted. So,
it looks like that. You can see
yeah.
because the detail
Right.
is just infinite inside each of these. It's just stunning. These little tiny circles. I mean, so
it was really worked.
incredibly tedious.
Oh yeah, this
And they almost
one
look
took,
like you hand painted them or
never,
something.
never.
But,
I don't hand paint anything. I like a sprayed
but
surface.
I do like this contrast with the gray and white
Right.
and black. I mean, that really sort of sets it apart. But again, this is just this wonderful sort of layering, and there's tremendous depth because these clearly come way out. These almost become perspectival or sort of more atmospheric and go back. These totally get lost just because they're on the same frequency or whatever of the major element, and so they get sort of just sort of blended in. But when you get up close to it, you just see all this incredible detail. And then this is entirely different altogether with the blue. So yeah, this is a spectacular one. So good to know then that this one actually, these were sort of individually done. And so this one,
Yes.
you were in and out of this piece a lot.
Oh, over 9 months,
Wow.
almost a year too. These are really laborious, and some come quicker than others, of course. Mm-hmm. But this one just was a battle, and it was a kind of breakthrough piece where I realized that I just realized quite a few things in the make of it, mm-hmm. and the fracturing. Again, how could I have such a fractured surface, meaning so many disparate parts, coloration, mm-hmm. and still bring it to something, mm-hmm. to a point of focus. And so some of it was a lot of working and looking to find, the blue was so instrumental to kind of disrupting all the orange coloration and the kind of, things can get so compressed even in this slim space that you mm-hmm. don't have enough distance between. So I knew I had to work really to pull things apart, mm-hmm. color and pattern, using color and pattern.
Right.
And the frame, I realized it had to come from, but also unify, because there was so much energy in the center part.
Yeah, and that blue down here becomes really important because what it does is it makes this blue out here pop.
Right.
It creates that continuity, but also this lyrical movement of this leaf form is very unifying. Mm-hmm. And it echoes in many ways the circular forms. Yeah. So it keeps it really tight in that regard. But this is a good example of where color and pattern, really can tie things together.
Absolutely.
And sort of work more as one unit as opposed to the individual elements. And that's right. The other thing with pattern painting that, when you think about, your pattern painting is a little bit different than when you think of people like, Gloria Klein and a lot of the other people in the crisscross movement, where they were basically, it was, what's the word I'm looking for? The Whitney did a show on it. It was like programming. So they were algorithmic, and mm-hmm. so they would just assign colors, and if it was a 1, it was this, if it's a 2, it's that, it's a 3, or whatever. And so these patterns would emerge because of that consistency. Right. But you could, like Gloria Klein used to create a hiccup or a break, to create just something where it just sort of broke the monotony. But she was a master at pattern over pattern over pattern. And so she would vary, the elements were the same, but she would vary the length or the size or something like that. And so that you could kind of see these different patterns sort of emerging simultaneously. Right. And so the density of it, the color became so important in choosing those palettes to help with that distinction. And so you really had to think these things out before you embarked on them. I mean,
that's very true.
And in her case, she did a lot of studies on graph paper to see how these things would start emerging and how the palettes would work. But it was all geometric.
She's using optical illusion quite often to create, that kind of secondary, third, and fourth patterning that you get from distant distance or closeness, the relationship of the body to the pattern. If you got up on our paintings, you might see them as this continuous thing. You get back and you're starting to make circles or triangles.
Right.
All of that is all about the relationship of the viewer to the object.
And the other thing too is just that density in patterns and that rhythm. What it does is it sort of activates the eye. So
Yes.
the power of suggestion becomes much greater, because your eye and mind want to make sense of these things. And so the Gestalt starts taking over. You start seeing
Yes.
triangular shapes or squares or something like that, because they do start emerging. You're trying to make sense of this, the density of the data. And so that's always a fascinating thing. And I agree with you, these things look totally different. And also the angle that you're at,
Absolutely.
because the incidence of the light,
Right.
also affects these things in the surface and glare. So so there's a lot that goes into this sort of work that a lot of people don't appreciate. One of the things you have done, I think partly because of the sanding and whatever overlay you spray on these, if it's some sort of acrylic or something, is these are somewhat matte. There's not a lot of sheen to these.
There's none.
And
really.
so that really is a blessing, I think, with this work, because you could then see the patterns. I got to think about that last night when I was looking at them. I thought, wow, if there was a high sheen on this and a lot of glare, these would become really difficult to discern. And that's why the incidence of the the angle that I'm looking at, these read the same when you walk around. There is a little bit of opticality in the way you have this geometric thing going, but that's just a different sort of effect. But what's nice is you're not getting a lot of glare on these, so whether you're at an angle or straight on, you're getting a good read on them.
Yeah.
And it's not quite the same as when you're using a bit of a sheen in the acrylic paint, and then you're dealing with the glare and how that's interacting with the color and the surface and where you are in relationship to that. But the distancing is a very good point, and your paintings also benefit from that. The further you stand back, the more you can really see them, and discern sort of the bigger picture of what the composition is. And then when you get up on them, then they become very, engaging and getting into the details.
Right.
So just so that people understand, Invisible Bloom then, as a circle back to the title, is because of the nature of the materials as described and the use of a lot of floral motifs. They do become very camouflaged in amongst all of this other pattern and density of data. And so, but when you do get up close, you do see sometimes a flower or a bloom, and hence the title is, which I thought was very clever. And I like the title. I thought that was really good, because looking at it, you're like going, I don't get it. And then now, especially that one over there, where when you told me there was a bisected rosebud, then I was like, wow, okay, that's like totally an invisible flower.
That's part of the idea, right?
So that's really, it's quite good. So any other thoughts or things that you're...
Well, I think one of the things that you're talking about, the optical illusions, one is that I'm using as a basis the casting. These are repeats. They're repeating static patterns. So all fabric has a repeat. This, it repeats itself. And so I'm always fighting against that repeating, because that creates a kind of visual monotony unless you start using reflective surfaces or coloration that is used to pop each section of the piece, as you were just describing. And I did that for years, and at a certain point when I moved from Detroit to Santa Fe, I really wanted to try working flat with flat pigment, pigment that wasn't built to be seen with a shiny surface, or they call it angle of incidence. You basically said it, a paint that reveals itself according to the viewer's position and distance from it. That's what a car is about.
Right.
As the car moves, the paint changes, and it's something in the world that is painted in a certain way because it will always be moving generally.
Right.
Right, we'll always see it in that way.
Right, that's a good point.
So,
hence a lot of use of metallic paints.
Exactly,
cars.
metallic bases with a transparent colorant. So I'm starting with a kind of parameter that locks me down into a repeat, and I'm always fighting against the monotony of a repeat. How do I use it? And part of it is fracturing, reconstitution, and then working with layering and positioning in that very, very small space that I have available to me on this surface.
Right.
So I'm orchestrating the space, the very tight space of that.
Right.
That's very important.